Este episodio va a ser totalmente en inglés. La persona que nos está acompañando hoy solamente habla y entiende inglés. Sé que es algo distinto para las personas que hablan inglés. Este va a ser un episodio, y los próximos episodios con la tía Vickie. Va a ser bastante interesante. Hello, Auntie Vickie. How's it going?
Good, darling. How are you?
Good. So tell me about yourself.
Well, myself is 74 years old. I'm a retired attorney, retired college professor. My finest hour, I guess, is neither of those things. It's really motherhood.
Okay.
I have a son. He's my only child, and he's produced 2 grandchildren for me. So
Nice.
I think they are my finest hour. You wanted me to talk a little bit about my background.
Yes, please.
So I was born in a small North Florida town, Quincy, Florida, which was the epitome of the antebellum South. The town that I was born in the county in Florida, Gadsden County, Quincy, Florida, was once the largest producer of cigar tobacco in America.
Wow.
And it produced more cigar tobacco than Cuba.
Wow.
And
I didn't know that.
It has something called the tobacco millionaires, because according to one Chamber of Commerce report, there were more millionaires per 1,000 populations in Quincy, Gadsden, Florida than anywhere else in the world.
Wow.
Tobacco millionaires. And of course, the industry was sustained by initially slave labor and ultimately indentured servitude and what we call field hand tobacco workers, who both planted the tobacco seeds,
Mm-hmm.
harvested the tobacco seeds, and produced the cigars from those tobacco plants, which were only grown for cigar tobacco. We did not do cigarette tobacco. I can actually go back 7 to 8 generations of folk who lived in Gadsden County, Florida. A lot of history for lynchings. Civil rights were non-existent. The Jim Crow South can be epitomized by Gadsden County, Florida.
What year was this?
I was born in 1949. I'm 74 years old.
Mm-hmm.
My mother, who went to college, went to Florida A&M, was raised by a widowed mother of 3. All 3 of her children, even though she was a tobacco worker, my grandmother sent all of her children, or they helped send themselves, actually.
Mm-hmm.
All of them are college graduates. And with me, it wasn't so much, are you going to college, because of those 3 people. But it's really more, what college are you going to? Because it was expected.
Mm-hmm.
My grandmother, to make ends meet, because she was widowed when my mother was 3, she sold ethnic cosmetics. That means black
Mm-hmm.
cosmetics. She sold all kinds of things like face powder, perfumes, deodorants,
Mm-hmm.
things that they did not market in the local stores or pharmacies for black women. She was also, my grandmother only had a 4th grade education, but she sent all of her children. She lived to see all of her children in college. And when she was when she was in the 4th grade, she was required to stop school because her grandmother, who reared her, needed the income. My grandmother's mother, who would be my great-grandmother, was named Angeline Weish. My great-great-grandmother was named Victoria Weish, and I am named for the 2 of them. My name is Vickie for Victoria,
Mm-hmm.
Ann for Angeline. But my great-grandmother Angeline died when my grandmother was 2. She died in childbirth, actually, with twins.
Wow.
So my grandmother was actually raised by her grandmother, who would have been my 2nd generation grandmother, my great-great-grandmother, Victoria. And my grandmother was required to stop school in the 4th grade. But she was so bright that she wrote letters for old people and Not many people could read and write. She wanted to be a nurse. And when she became older, she was somebody that everybody consulted on all kinds of illnesses because that was her passion. She grew all kinds of vegetables, all kinds of herbs, and all kinds of barnyard animals. You know.
So she never became a
Never
nurse?
became a nurse. She worked in tobacco until she was about 60 years old. And my uncle, who had graduated from Morgan State University after a stint in the Air Force, a 4-year stint in the Air Force, he became a chemist. In fact, he was the first black chemist hired by a major chemical company, American Cyanamid.
What was his name?
His name was Clarence Sutton. And my mother and my uncle and my aunt were reared by my grandmother as a widow. She said, I'm a poor widow woman. She used to tell everybody that. But she was anything but poor, because even in the tobacco field, she was enterprising. She sold candy bars. She sold cookies, crackers. She sold cosmetics. But she always was a learner. And although she had to stop school, public school, in the 4th grade to work, she never stopped learning. I can remember in my grandmother's house, which is where eventually my mother and I lived until my mother migrated to New Jersey. We always got 3 papers: Tallahassee Democrat, the Florida Times-Union, and the Pittsburgh Courier, which was a national black paper. She subscribed to things like the National Geographic magazine.
Mm-hmm.
So there was always reading and learning in my growing up environment. My grandmother was the person in the neighborhood who did everybody's taxes.
Wow.
She wrote all the obituaries. She wrote many obituaries for colored people because she was learned, even though she was not educated.
Mm-hmm.
And she did things like write letters for folk who couldn't read and write to their relatives who had migrated away from Gadsden County, either to other places in the South or out west, but a lot of the time to the northeast.
Do you remember her age at that time?
My grandmother at that age had to be like in her 50s.
Okay.
By the time I was old enough to really, really remember these things that I'm talking about.
Mm-hmm.
My mother was a young mother, and my grandmother was probably about 23 years old when she had my mother. My mother was the middle child. And the way it worked was my uncle, who was the oldest, went to the Air Force so that he was able to go to historically black college, I might say,
mm-hmm.
Morgan State, on a GI Bill. And he actually, while in the Air Force, helped my mother attend Florida A&M University, which is also a historically black university, even though I ended up at Rutgers, which is anything but. So it was like a family kind of thing that we didn't talk about, but it's just the way we lived. You were well-read, you were well-raised, you spoke the King's English.
Mm-hmm.
Like I remember, this is an anecdote, I remember when I was little, if I would say things like, where's so-and-so at?
Mm-hmm.
My grandmother now, the 4th grade education, would say behind that preposition at, which taught me not to use prepositions at the end of sentences. So I had to know the King's English, but by knowing the King's English, it made it easier for me to do well in school. So my uncle helped my mother go to college. My mother worked 3 jobs, sometimes to help herself through college. She would work at evenings at white families' homes, at dinner parties because she could cook and
mm-hmm.
sew and clean. And while at Florida A&M, they didn't have like a nursing school. So people who wanted to go into nursing had to actually major in home economics.
What's home economics?
Home economics teaches you not just how to cook, how to sew, how to do those kinds of things,
mm-hmm.
but it taught you the chemistry associated with those things. You had to know ratios, had to know chemical symbolisms and all that kind of stuff, even to major in home economics. because it had to do with cooking and ratios and things like that. But that's how it was back then.
Where do you learn this?
She learned it at college. I mean, she was a student at Florida A&M.
So this was a part of the school
Part
curriculum?
of the university curriculum, yes.
Oh, yeah? Wow.
And folk who, that was the closest thing to nursing and chemistry, I guess, home economics. But my mother was able to support herself as a seamstress. She would work after hours at white folks' homes. And in the summers, she would work tobacco. She would do what we call stringing tobacco. You know, once the tobacco is harvested, we call it picked. Once it's harvested, it's brought to a barn, and people actually have to string it up on strings so they can be hung up in barns to be cured. And once it's cured, it's taken out of the barns and taken to what we call packing houses. And the packing houses would be where the cigars were actually rolled. And that was considered a prestigious thing because everybody who worked in tobacco in the field, in the harvesting and the preparing it, didn't get jobs in the wintertime at what we call packing houses. But my grandma was fortunate always to have a job. My grandma also was like badass. She was like badass. Like, I remember my uncle, when he was in high school, had a job at a white funeral home. And he was probably slouching off or something. You know, he was a teenager. He was a kid. And the owner of the funeral home hit him with a broom on the butt. And my grandma heard about it, and she went to the funeral home in this in this town. And she told the white funeral home director that if he ever hit her child again, she would kill him.
Wow.
That's simple. Because you did not hit her children. And she says, I'm a poor widow woman, and I don't have much standing. But if you hit my child, I will kill you. And everybody knew that. They called her Old Black Thelma. And this is also anecdotal, but she said when she was real little, they used to call her Little Black Thelma. She says as she got older into young adulthood, folk would call her Black Thelma. And then when she got old, people would call her Old Black Thelma, you know. So I was trying to tell her that black was beautiful. She said, no, I ain't never been beautiful. Old Black Thelma, Little Black Thelma. She said, black is beautiful cannot save everybody. Because she was an older woman then. And she never reconciled that she could be beautiful because she had not grown up feeling beautiful. And a lot of her investment in feeling good about who you are and that you can do anything out in the world was sort of planted in me. I became the source of her pride and her source of her joy. And that sustained me in many, many ways because I was like one of those overachievers. But growing up in the rural South with Jim Crow, you couldn't drink from water fountains that weren't black marked. Couldn't sit at counters. You couldn't go in certain areas of pharmacies. You imagine trying to get medicine and you got to go through all these Jim Crow protocols. If you were walking down the street and a white person approached you and you were on the sidewalk, you were supposed to step aside and let them pass so you don't impede their progress.
Was this also part of Florida?
It was all Florida. This was all Florida. But obviously my parents were not married to each other, and but I had two wonderful parents. I had a father who loved me. I had a mother who loved me. And my father was a master sergeant in the Army, and he got together with my bonus mother. Some people call those stepmothers. I don't know. Mine was a bonus because I've always felt loved by her. And he deployed. When he was finished with service, I forgot what term they call that. He got out of the Army and landed in San Pedro, which is right down the street. This is how we got to California. And my bonus mother was living in L.A. with her aunt while he was in the Army. And when he got out of the Army, they got an apartment in L.A. And they stayed in L.A. until they bought this house in Compton. I remember it so well. It was 1961. And I was all excited because I had my own bedroom. The blue room right there was my bedroom. The room across the hall was Medea and Pop's. And what is now the upper den used to be Jimmy and Tootie's room. So I had my own bedroom. I was like happy about that. And I was my father's only daughter. He was his father's only son. And
So you guys got a connection there.
we had a very special kind of, and I look exactly like him. So that was, I used to not like that. But as I got older, I said, okay, I got to look like somebody. So it looks, and it was so noticeable. It was striking. I remember at his funeral, somebody said, "Oh my God, I thought that was Mr. Donaldson standing up there for a minute."
Wow.
Till I looked at it. But anyway, he ended up in San Pedro and eventually in Compton, in this house where we're doing this interview. And my mother immigrated to the Northeast, Newark, New Jersey.
Mm-hmm. And
she couldn't get a job in nursing at all. So she went to work at a Chinese laundry. And that was like a hot house, hell house. You know, it's so hot in there. Mm-hmm. Her thing was that she was on a mission. She had to make sure that I was taken care of. I used to spend summers in Compton with my father. And the next summer I had to spend with my mother in New Jersey because I stayed in Florida with my grandmother as my father left Florida and my mother left Florida. So at points, you know, I have a lot to reconcile in terms of feeling sort of unwanted because I said, why everybody leave me? But they left me in the best possible situation because if I had to attribute anything that I've become to any one person, it would be my grandmother because she gave us so much.
How old were you back then?
I moved. My mother moved to New Jersey when I was 11. My father relocated to L.A. when I was 5. So, you know, it's hard. It's easy for a child to feel like, you know, why can't I go too? But it was economics of scale. The economy of scale did not support that folk could do well and still worry about a girl child, you know. So that was the luck of the draw. But
when you stay with your grandma, what do you get from her when you were just with her since your parents had left?
I got absolute devotion, for one thing. I got absolute support. If there was anything that I needed, I knew my grandma had my back. She knew that anything that I needed, I had some folk who were supporting me. Mm-hmm. My mother worked so she could support me. I was her only child for 17 years until she got married to my bonus father. And I never was hungry. I was always well dressed better than most. At Easter just passed, but it reminds me that Easter I would have 3 dresses. I would have one that my grandma bought, one that my mother sent, and one that my father sent. So I would have a dress for the morning, Sunday school, a dress for church at 11 o'clock, and a church for the Easter program. That's what they called it, where Easter Sunday afternoon, you know, you said your little speeches and stuff. You got dressed all up in your Easter clothes. I wasn't spoiled, but I was very well supported. My grandmother was stern, but my mother said that all the harshness that they experienced from my grandmother, because she was a working woman with 3 kids, and as she said, she was a proud widow woman. My grandmother indulged me, you know. My grandmother used to say, no matter how she crossed her legs, I would always find a way to get in her lap. It is even when my mother was in the same house, but that's our relationship. If there was a program at school, if there was a program at church, I knew that my grandmother, my mother's mother, and my grandfather, my father's father, would be there. And sometimes folk thought they were married to each other because they would all show up at my programs. My grandfather had a car. He would give my grandma a ride. And for a long time, everybody thought that. But no, that was my father's father and my mother's mother. So my grandfather, which is another story, my grandfather, my father's father, my dear's father-in-law, was a bootlegger.
What is that?
Person who sold illegal liquor. But he was also a businessman. Okay. He sold, in the days when I was young, he was the ice man. So he supplied ice to all the black families. He was a woodman. He supplied wood because everybody had wood stoves and wood fireplaces, and electric appliances came later. You had to be sort of well off to when you first got your electric appliances. But I was my grandfather's only granddaughter.
Mm-hmm.
I was my father's only daughter. And to this day, that's absolutely true. I had 2 brothers by my father later on, and I had a sister and a brother by my mother. But by the time I was always the oldest, I did very, very well in school. I always scored very high on those tests and stuff. So I was very, very well supported in that community. And like any kid who's not living with their parents, I always felt some kind of way about that. So that's part of my therapy that is ongoing, to try and reconcile that I'm worthy. That to this day I struggle with whether or not I'm worthy.
Really? Until this day?
Oh, sure, absolutely. So anyway, I went to school in a segregated South, but I was what they call a super achiever.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what that was, genes or my grandmother's nurturing or my mother's insistence that I could do and be anything and anybody in the world. I was president of my class for 3 of the 4 years in high school. I always scored high on those achievement tests. So I was what back in the day they would call a super nigger.
What?
That's what they would call me.
Wow.
And that's in our community. I don't know what they would call me in the white community. But when I got ready to go to college, there was never a question of if you're going to college. My mother and my grandmother always insisted that it's a matter of which college you're going to go to. And they worked hard so that there was no obstacle, especially monetarily. I guess you could say they were invested in me.
Mm-hmm.
I chose the college and then I decided to go. But I was blessed that I was one of those super niggas because I got into like 25. I kept applying to colleges all over. Rutgers, Yale, actually Columbia, which was Barnett's College, Radcliffe, all the Ivy League schools.
Mm-hmm.
And I applied to all the schools that had strong journalism departments. University of Missouri, Rutgers was also one. Emerson College was one. Because I was going to be a journalist. I was going to write the quintessential racial satire.
That's what you always wanted to do?
That's what I wanted to do. And when it came down to it, because my mother was a New Jersey resident, I got New Jersey residency, which meant that Rutgers, which had a great journalism department, Douglas College of Rutgers, I got accepted. And it was like sort of easy. Rutgers had this quota system that they only took 10%. They took 15, 20 black students each year, and that was it. On 3 campuses now.
Mm-hmm.
So,
were there a lot of black kids applying?
They didn't have many black kids applying, even the ones who lived in cities like Newark, because the school system told them that they couldn't get into Rutgers. They weren't good enough. So they steered, the guidance counselors in New Jersey steered black students to historically black universities. But there were several reasons why I chose Rutgers. Mm-hmm. One was that my mother being a resident would qualify, and I think the tuition for state residents at Rutgers was only $250 a semester. And my mother said, I could write that check easy, And I could stay at home because Rutgers in Newark at that time did not have dorms. And I didn't want to go to New Brunswick because when I went to Rutgers, it was the year of the rebellion. Some white people call it the riots.
What year was that?
1967. Graduated from high school. I wanted to be in Newark because I was a civil rights kid. That's a whole nother story. I don't know if you got time, but...
Oh, yeah, we can talk the next chapter. We can talk about it.
Okay. But I chose Rutgers for those reasons. Now, in 1965, I was in Compton, the year of the riots. Mm-hmm. That's right. So my mother said, everywhere you go, they have...
He's following you.
these riots. But we call it rebellions. But Watts always got called. I mean, L.A. was always called the riots, but Newark was the center of the Black Arts Movement, and it was never called by us. It was never called a riot. It was always a rebellion. So I came to Rutgers out of the Civil Rights Movement, and that would probably take us to the next chapter, because I'd have to tell you that one of the reasons I did not like to be in Compton after I was about 16 was because I was involved in civil rights issues in my hometown. And I would, as an intro to that, I'll just say this. My grandfather was not only a bootlegger, but he was a businessman, sold ice, sold wood. And he was what they call a crazy nigger. I'm saying this to you because it's who we were then. Now we can call ourselves.
What's a crazy?
Yeah.
What did it mean back then, being crazy?
It meant that he was a black man who would shoot you.
Oh.
He did not get picked on, played with. They discriminated. He was still a nigger, but to them. Mm-hmm. But he had the wherewithal. He had a nice house. He could build his own. He built his own house. He had a huge wood pile, and all kind of stuff. So he was considered well off. Moonshiners, bootleggers in the South. Mm-hmm. That's where wealth resided. If you were a bootlegger, it meant you had money. He was crazy, so it meant he had power.
Were you able to see this kind of power around
Oh, absolutely. There are many times I would be on a march. Mm-hmm. They shot beside my grandma's house to scare me. Mm-hmm. And, of course, she got on the phone. She called Pop. She called my mother. And she said, oh, y'all got to get her. They going to kill her. They going to kill her. But my grandfather would discourage it. I can remember him getting on the phone, put me on the phone with Pop and saying, you got to tell her to stop. And Pop would call my mother. And my mother said, well, if we had done all that, she wouldn't have to do it now. So my mother refused to pull me off of marches or protests or boycotts. I think my father would have if he could have, because his thing was fear for his daughter. Mm-hmm. But my mother's thing was, remember, she was a student at Florida A&M, and a lot of the stuff that happened in North Florida happened around Florida A&M students. And she had worked for one of those parties. He was a white dentist. And she had found a Ku Klux Klan robe in his closet. Oh. So she became militant sort of automatically, And that was interesting. Because she died with my bail money in her wallet. She did. After all those years, she always kept my bail money because I was always getting in trouble. For the good stuff.
Were you ever in jail?
Yes. Oh, Lord.
Somebody
said 52 times, but I don't know how many.
Would you agree?
Oh, well,
even more?
I was the whole point of boycotting and marching was to get arrested, because being arrested brought attention to what you were doing. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, nobody would know. So what's the point of going quietly to jail? The idea was to create a presence that would be noted in our community to give people support to come out for, or give them the courage to come out and support us. And the other was to go to jail so people outside of our community would have an eye on us and they would know what we were doing and why.
Was it media covering this? Newspapers?
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm. Of course. Because my hometown was 21 miles from the state capitol, Tallahassee. So that was it's an area called the Florida Big Bend area. But it's that way, like Florida comes up and curves. Mm-hmm. It's right there. And it's 21 miles from Georgia in one direction, 21 miles from Alabama in a different direction, Dothan, Bainbridge on the Georgia side, and 21 miles from the state capitol, which was Tallahassee. So, yeah, there was a little interest in what we were doing. And one of the persons who organized us became very, very famous. Her name was Patricia Stevens Dew. And I met her first as my chemistry teacher.
You didn't know what she was?
Yeah, she was my chemistry teacher, but she was a local organizer.
Okay.
So I was a good student. I got an A in chemistry, I think, or B. I don't know. Chemistry might have been my worst subject. I'm not sure. But I did well. And she got married to a person named John. Her name was Patricia Stevens. She married a brother named John Dew, who is well known in the Miami area for his civil rights stuff. They both were members of CORE, which is the Congress of Racial Equality. It was one of the three major civil rights organizations in the South at that time. CORE, Congress of Racial Equality, SCLC, which was the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and the NAACP. So we were more militant, so we joined CORE. And we were her students. That's how we got involved in civil rights, through our chemistry teacher.
Thank you for listening to this episode. The second part is coming right up.